Hi, this is Dave Stelzl, and we're at the Defcon Conference out in Las Vegas today. And I'm just wrapping up having delivered some important information to the Cisco Partner community. The question we've been trying to ask is, how do we use a security assessment to drive new business? So over the course of the year, I've covered topics such as, how do we use risk to drive business, any kind of business? And how do we conduct effective demand generation events? How do we get executives to actually show up to these things? How do we get away from traditional lunch and learns and actually do something that's meaningful? And then once done, how do we gain access or continue to gain access to executives that are going to make decisions? How do we go through the discovery process? And so we're wrapping up today by talking about how do we use the house in the cloud, based on a book that I wrote several years ago, to get in and stay in at the executive level and move through the process to deliver some justification that actually is going to result in business. Some of the key security trends that we see out there, and of course the bots and the phishing, the identity theft, the information theft has been prevalent for years, along with social engineering. There's really nothing new here. So I started off with 7 major trends that I typically go through with executives when doing some kind of briefing like this. The first is the advancements in technology. I'm talking about hacking technology here. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal published an article talking about LulzSec and Anonymous and how they have demonstrated to us that regardless of what we have in place, it seems like they can get in. It's a call to executives to wake up and realize that what the message that they're getting from IT, that we've got it covered, just is not true. Number 2 is the growing demand for data. Recent news concerning Rupert Murdoch, as he demonstrates the value of data in terms of identifying news that matters to the world and identifying it before anybody else gets to it, but using illegal means to gain it. Number 3, we talked about mobile devices. And we read about Vanessa Hudgens and others who have had data leaked out through mobile devices that are insecure. Number 4, data leakage. Number 5 was social media. And then number 7, we talked about some of the warfare kind of things that are taking place, and consider hacking an act of war. These are simply topics that can be used as briefings. The lunch and learn is over. People are tired of going to lunch and learns and hearing about products, hearing from systems engineers, hearing about security in general. But briefing still has a place, and we can see that because the Wall Street Journal continues to publish information on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, concerning hacking type activity. The important thing here is to understand what the objective is. The objective is not just to spew product information, but it's to bring out briefing type information that's pertinent to executives who are liable for information, and then to gain steps of permission along the way. The permission to get them to come to an event, and then to show them what's actually happening in their organization and get permission to take a look and see if there's a problem, and then to go through a discovery process that makes sense at the executive level that keeps them involved, so that we can get to that point where we deliver justification. And justification is going to be focused on impact and likelihood. And so we've got to get in there and understand what that impact is at an executive asset owner level, and then deliver likelihood that's credible, which creates justification. The question is, how does that work? Well, I use the house in the cloud model to open that door, to gain that permission. The house model simply shows how houses today are protected. And so in my analogy, I go into a physical model that allows an executive to relate to their own home in terms of how it's protected. Everyone knows that a house can be broken into fairly easily, but people feel fairly safe about their house. Why is that? Well, it's because they're depending not on the ability to keep intruders out, but they expect to hear that person, or for an alarm to go off, or for somebody to see that person. It's a detection mechanism. And so we go through the house model and we list all the things that people use to protect their house: the doors, the windows, the fences, the alarms, the motion detectors, the neighbors, crime watch, perhaps weaponry, or pets, or something. And by asking the executives to think about which one of these areas is more important, protection, detection, response, many will choose protection, but in fact, it's detection. We see that in the physical model because we expect that people will be able to break down a door. In the data world, we haven't viewed it that way. If you look at traditional data security, it's been built on perimeter security, firewalls, encryption, passwords, and this doesn't really work. We see it in the physical model, but we don't see it in the data model. Why? Because the data model is not concrete. It's not something that an executive can visualize. And so we have statistics out there that show us that hundreds of thousands and millions, hundreds of millions of people have been infiltrated, have had their identities and have information stolen, and have been broken into regardless of how much money they spend on security. And the model ties up with what I call the coverage model, which shows us that protection, detection, response in areas of administrative, physical, and technical security, building a matrix of 9 boxes, bring together a unified security strategy that is primarily focused on that ability to detect. In my presentation, I went through some of the marketing concepts. See, it's not enough just to deliver a presentation. There has to be a marketing element built into it. It must be simple. It must be concrete, disruptive. It must be credible, emotion to it, get people to feel. I do this by creating a series of knowledge gaps, of statements and questions that get executives going, how can that be? Or why is that? I create interruptions in their thinking by bringing things up that they would think would be one way but actually are another. I get them to make commitment by raising their hand and verbalizing what they think before showing them what the truth is. I must in this presentation give them some kind of unexpected revelation so that at the end of the meeting they're going, wow, I didn't know that. This creates permission. When I start out the house discussion, I start out with a question. Have you ever thought about how security works? Most people haven't thought about data security and how it works, particularly at an asset owner level. When I explain to them that all security works the same, it causes them to ask the question, well, how is that? How can a bank and a house and a network all work the same? Of course, what I'm referring to is that protection, detection, response process. It's a process. It's a system that works together to secure assets. I ask my audience to think about which column matters most. Is it protection? Is it detection? Is it response? 90% of them will think it's protection, when in fact it's detection. When I show them the cloud model, I start out by saying something like, let me show you how simple it is to break in. See, this interrupts their thinking because IT has told them we've got it covered. And so when I make that statement, it is simple to break in. They want to know why. It creates a knowledge gap. And toward the end, when I ask them which one is their organization focused on, protection, detection, response, that leading question is, do you use firewalls, passwords, encryption, that sort of thing? Of course, they're nodding. That's what we do. We're in the protection world. How do we move to a detection? And it creates a knowledge gap. And of course, that knowledge gap is fulfilled by showing them the coverage model. The coverage model, protection, detection, response. Administrative, technical, physical, the 9-box matrix that shows the synergy of all these elements working together to build a defense around data. This causes the executive to say, well, should we at least check? And this is permission. This is permission to go in and work at the asset owner level, but I must have a simple process to take them through now that's going to allow me to discover where that urgency is, and that's all I care about. I can do a full-blown assessment some other time, but right now I'm just looking for urgency. Where is the big hole? Once identified, now I can show impact versus likelihood. Likelihood now being very high because I've discovered an urgent hole, and most companies have an urgent hole. The question is, do I have a process that will allow me to discover it quickly? The deliverable can't be technical. It must be a marketing document. It must convince my asset owner to move forward. Some security people react to that idea. But the truth is that if my client has something urgent that must be done and I fail to convince them to do it, then I have failed as a consultant. And so I call the assessment deliverable a marketing document because it must convince the asset owner to move forward. And if it doesn't do that, it's of no value. It must clearly show what matters, and it must provide clear steps of action. And so I use a simple outline. The first being the graph, impact versus likelihood. Secondly, identifying the high impact applications that they've given me. Third, listing the major issues and identifying a priority. And followed up finally then by recommendations. Some recommendations which are things they can do internally. Probably 80% of the problem can be solved if they'll make some changes internally. Policy, education, as well as some configuration changes. But generally there are some key things that must be done by the consultant that are going to involve some products and services, maybe managed services. This leads to the larger architectural deal. But of course, it must be presented in a way that allows that executive to visualize it. And so, of course, we talked about ways to create that visualization. What if this could happen? What if that could happen? And of course, I'm looking for nods among my asset owners. Is this something they can visualize in their organization? So in summary, focus on risk. Risk is the urgency. Use briefings. Not lunch and learns, but briefings that grab the attention of an executive. Make them educational. Work on messaging that matters with urgency. Develop a discovery process that allows you to stay at the top. Then deliver business justification, that marketing document, that document that communicates at the business level to the business people about assets. And finally, visualize those results. Show them what you're talking about. Let them see it. And this is what creates justification to create new budget. It's not a matter of what budget's been established. It's a matter of what the urgent need is and what budget can be established.